So, hi everybody. When I was developing these slides, I was really excited because this has been a project I've been working on for the last 9 months, and I was trying to figure out how to condense this down into a short period of time so that I could convey a way of developing an agile architecture that would be useful, I hope, for anybody listening in the audience. I'm going to try and go through this really quickly. I am kind of passionate about it, so I hope there's time at the end of it for some questions. So, who am I? My name's Alex. I'm a solution architect. I've been a software engineer for longer than I care to remember. I've been a solution architect for about half of that time. I'm an agilist at heart. I believe that you've got to deliver business value in order to be valuable to your company. It might not look like it, but I'm a mountain biker, and it certainly does look like it. I'm a craft beer enthusiast. So this is just an overview of what I'm going to take you through today. I'm going to give you a little bit of context for what the project's about. Then I'm going to describe what the project is. Then I'm going to tell you a bit about an agile approach that we took to developing this architecture. Give you some takeaways that you might want to consider if you choose to adopt something like this yourselves. And then I'll give you a conclusion at the end. So, as you know, Telegraph is one of the UK's most popular websites, news websites. We publish roughly 250 to 300 articles on a daily basis, covering a variety of topics, written by journalists around the world, and these result in millions and millions of page views on a daily basis. One of our aspirations, one of our strategic goals is to acquire 10 million registered users, and MyTelegraph was conceived in late 2017 and 2018 as a tool to make it fast and easy for registered users to discover and engage with relevant content in order to encourage them to keep coming back to our site. So what I mean by these words, there's a couple of call-outs that I'd like to point out. Well, fast, we're going to let people know that there's an article as it's being published on the site across all of their devices, whatever they may be, and make it easy so they can go to a single location to find what they're looking for. We need to know who you are so that we can curate this content for you, so you need to register. Discover and engage. We want to let you follow topics or journalists that you are interested in. We want you to be able to save articles and come back to a single relevant, personalized space for you that's personalized for you. Now, the vision of MyTelegraph is a lot bigger than just following topics and journalists, and we know that it's going to touch on multiple areas in the business. Historically, when you tackle a large project like this, touching on multiple business areas, you need a good understanding of your requirements. You need, potentially, you look at the big upfront design, and you want a dedicated project team to build this out. Some of the call-outs, some problems with this is it limits your scope and what you can do with experimentation and adoption of new technologies, especially something that could simplify your solution in the longer term. It also restricts you in the opportunities for learning from what your clients or your users actually want to use and delight them in coming back to the site. It also assumes that you know what customers want to personalize. So when we started the project, the requirements weren't fixed and they changed often, sometimes multiple times a day. All while the project was being solidified and the ideas for it, it was absolutely clear that we had a deadline. As was spoken to earlier, we wanted to deliver this by the Football World Cup earlier this year, so we had to get started. We wanted to garner interest in the project. We didn't know how we were going to do that, so we had to figure out how we were going to do this across the different business domains. What we did want was an MVP. We heard that earlier. It's a minimum viable product, but we wanted something that we could build on, not something that was just throw out there and just use it and it was trashy. We wanted something that we could build on. So we took a different approach to working on our first personalization project here. We decided that we would produce architecture artifacts just in time, just as they were needed for the various departments, various teams to work on. That would allow us to explore new cloud offerings, look at different providers. As long as we were underpinned by a solid foundational architecture, we knew that we could deliver something that would see us for the long term. We could then test and learn from our users, enhance the project incrementally, and improve iteration by iteration. So how do we approach this? We decided that, like writing a good book, you need a plot line to build your story. You don't necessarily need to know that the butler killed the lord of the manor in the study with a knife, but you do need to know that he had a vendetta against the lord of the manor if that's who you're going to make the murder suspect. To that end, we adopted some principles that we shared amongst our stakeholders and got agreement with. We tried to look at some requirements that we knew were going to be possible to deliver for an MVP, specifically for the start of the World Cup. Then we took a look at the architecture and how we were going to build that out. And then lastly, we knew we were going to iterate. And we are still iterating now. We've had, I can't tell you how many releases we've had since we launched. I've lost count. So we came up with the following principles. These are based on some lean and agile architecture methodologies that are out in the wild. But we wanted to think big and act small. We want to think big strategically and make sure that the longer-term company objective is matched and reached. But we want to be able to deliver business functionality and business value incrementally, quickly. We decided to go for an emergent architecture, just in time, just enough. What do I mean by that? Well, we're going to produce artifacts just as they're needed, just in time for the team to start working on it. That does raise a risk, though. We may need to come back to look at an architectural decision and revisit it if the decision made at the time based on the information known is no longer valid for the next iteration that we're working on. Independent progress. We have multiple teams in this company. It's an awesome company. You should come work here. I love it. I'll tell you about that later. Development teams work on different areas of MyTelegraph, and we want to be able to release at different cadences, so we don't want to have blockers and rollout and big bangs. Data compliance. We don't want to store any sensitive information anywhere. It makes it harder for us we've got to write code to look after things, makes it harder for us to deal with rights to be forgotten requests. If there's no code written to maintain something, it means there's no security flaws that we can need to address. And lastly, every major decision we decided we would take through our technical design authority, which I may refer to later as the TDA. Apologies, I will try not to use acronyms unnecessarily. We want to make sure that our peers and certainly members of all of the heads of departments knew what we were doing, where we were doing it, and how we were doing it. So now we've got some principles that we've adopted. We've got some requirements. What are the requirements for a minimum viable product? Now there's 3 here which look fairly easy to address. The most basic of them are the top 3. The last 2 here are the ones that caught us out a little bit, but I will talk about them in a little bit. So what we know that we wanted, what our product owner wanted after the MVP, was to be able to deliver some incremental benefits, such as receiving a daily digest, which means, what articles did you miss the day before? We want to send that to you in an email to encourage you to keep coming back to the site. We want to be able to see and respond to comments in one place. That means we don't want to necessarily burden you, making you navigate through the site to see where you've written a comment or somebody has responded to you. Push notifications. Now, this is a touchy subject for a lot of people. You don't want to receive unnecessary notifications, but you might want to be notified whenever somebody writes a new scientific article on neuroscience, for argument's sake. Have to figure out how we're going to allow you to receive push notifications for specific topics versus other topics that you're not that interested in, but you still want to follow. Relevant articles. How do we recommend relevant articles to users? We need some kind of machine learning. We heard about it a little bit earlier. Some context tree or something to that effect. One person's used this, one person's used that. So therefore, if you're following this article and they've followed that, you might want to see this article as well. And not only saving articles, we want to be able to save things like travel itineraries. We have a travel section of our news site where people can go and plan what they want to do, or at least view articles and product information about hotels and travel. And they might want to share that with people that they're going on the journey with. How do we do that? We came up with some NFRs which were absolutely not negotiable, which the business doesn't really care about, but we needed to have independent progress across teams. I know that was a principle, but it's also an NFR. We didn't want to roll out in a big bang approach. That kind of speaks to the architecture approach, or the fundamental underlying architecture that we picked. Should fail open. We don't particularly, any user that hits an issue on the site shouldn't be restricted from accessing any content. They should at least get to a section of the site that they want to. And lastly, but not least, is the business logic shouldn't reside in the front end. We want to write it once and have everybody benefit from that. So we had a number of architecture patterns that we could look at. We could look at a monolith. We could build an event-driven architecture. We could look at a microservice or a mobile backend as a service. As a monolith, it's a good starting point when you're building out a project, but if it's going to be wildly successful, you're going to have to come back and refactor it, start looking at scaling problems. Event-driven, some of the requirements for the project naturally fit into an event-driven approach. The thought of triggering something was quite appealing, but it wasn't quite suitable for all of our requirements. Microservices, it's a big buzzword at the moment. It's clearly defined boundaries, very, very small functionality, very limited. Loosely coupled, easy, can make sure that our teams work in an independent fashion. Last but not least, the MBAS solution, or a mobile backend as a service. Mobile is a big part of our lives nowadays, and there are now offerings from the likes of Google and Amazon which provide you mobile backend as a service features. You can just take their SDKs, drop it on, and all the management of your infrastructure, the communication, backups, support is all managed for you. Very, very appealing when you're trying to get out something very, very quickly. But this is a look at or a view of what our MVP for MyTelegraph would look like. If you look at it through some rose-tinted glasses or slightly skew, it looks a little bit like a chat application where your single location for all of your comments is located. You have a notification or an alert that tells you something is there, and your ability to follow or join a channel. So if you look at that through some lenses, it looks like something like Firestore or Firebase would suit. Our mobile teams had good success with Firestore or Firebase, so we started looking at Firestore. Unfortunately, it was in beta, and some of the requirements, which was namely only show one alert, meant that we had to codify all of our business logic into multiple front ends, which is Android, web, iOS, soon to be Alexa, etc. Didn't make it practical, so we decided to follow a microservices-based approach. And we split the architecture into the following. We decided to work on an underpinning architecture. How would we build this? How would we follow and save? What would we do for my feed and saved articles? How would we send alerts? And then last, how would we do an email digest? This was for the MVP. Ultimately, we've got extra work that we have to do for other features. We built our architecture using you'll recognize some of the icons on here. We are a multi-cloud consumer. We use both Google and Amazon. We built it out based on a relational database for storing preferences, which is here. And I'm not going to go into the architecture because the premise of this talk is not the architecture itself, but how we approached it. This particular view is a lot more detailed than the previous architectural overview, and this is a way that we approached communicating the architecture to the various teams, doing a solution on a page. If you can't put it onto a single page, maybe double-sided, that a team can communicate, you can communicate easily to a team, you're not going to have, you're going to miss something. So we've adopted this approach where we have something which we take to our technical design authorities with some supporting documentation detailing the background and the context, with an overview of the solution, and then something that gives assumptions and caveats and pros and cons that allows us to make a relevant decision whether it's viable or not. We got multiple teams across the organization. Everybody has to work at their own cadence. So we used Swagger definitions to tie the teams together. That allowed people to generate their own stubs and work against mock data in order for them to proceed at their own pace. We used versioning on the APIs so that whenever there was a new breaking change, teams would be alerted to that. It's one of the problems that we experienced, which I will dive into a little bit. So some of our challenges, the stakeholder management, was not limited to just me on the project managing all of the various teams, but also the product manager had a lot of stakeholders from all the way across the organization up to C-level. And the temptation to build in something just in case, just because you aren't going to need it. If you don't need it, don't build it. It makes it hard to take it away. Analytics isn't an afterthought. We realized this too late in the game. Sorry, Chris. We should have engaged with the analytics team a lot earlier in the game. We needed analytics to understand how our users were using the application and what they found best about it. Maturity of the mobile backends as a service, as I said, the Google and Amazon offerings at the time were in beta. We are using Google Cloud Firestore at the moment to service our alerts. It still is in beta. We do have a couple of issues with it, but it is exceptionally good at what it does, which is managing WebSockets, real-time alerting, its real-time database, all of that infrastructure that we have to worry about, all of that code that we would have to worry about is taken care of for us. It's literally an SDK, we drop it in, write a couple of lines, and we have an alert. Communication, this old chestnut. Everybody says it when you talk in an agile meetup, but we missed one team. I can't emphasize it enough. You need to talk to everybody, even if you don't think you need to. We missed one team. We thought we were going to be doing all the work. The MyTelegraph team is fabulous, but they were overloaded. We had to rely on one of the other teams downstairs to give us some assistance, and we missed the communication, so they implemented a feature incorrectly, which is now, it's a bit of technical debt, but we're addressing it. Versioning the APIs. Don't go wild like I did. Use semantic versioning. Don't use semantic versioning, just use main version. We had, sorry Paul, but we had a semantic version. We were generating stubs, and communication wasn't as good as I would have liked. One of the mobile developers wasn't around when we updated, so he didn't hear, and for 3 weeks couldn't understand why his application wasn't working. Versioning has its place, but be pragmatic about it. Mobile requirements, everybody has mobile, and a lot of the requirements that we needed for our application were driven by the mobile team, but mobile is not the only thing. And in a lot of cases, building in a back-end for front-end API to sit between the front-end and the back-end is an appropriate choice. In conclusion, I've gone through this really quickly. Apologies if I've missed anything, but microservices are a really good thing. There is some school of thought that projects should be tackled using a monolithic approach in the first instance and then refactored to microservices as needed. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that. I think keeping a bounded context and a very, very clearly defined boundary between your applications and your services is really good. It does add to complexity, but it does mean you can move quickly. Don't be afraid to revisit past decisions. Google has updated their Firestore product based on some feedback that we've given them, which will allow us to do some work on the front end, which means we can revisit a lot of our decisions early on and simplify our architecture. We're not quite ready yet. It was only announced, or I was told, at Google Next last week. It's due to come in about 2 weeks, but don't be afraid to revisit your decisions. Try and document your solution on a page. It's easier to get your head around it. If I had to document, and I'm the architect on it, I've been breathing it for the last 9 months. If I have to document my entire solution, no one's going to read it. I'm not going to want to change it, and nothing's going to get done. Not allowed to laugh. Sorry, Juju. And collaborate. Please talk to everybody, even if you don't think you need to. You'll be surprised how many people are invested in your project, even if you don't think they are. With that, I'm open to any questions. Please have a look at our engineering@telegraph.co.uk. We are hiring. Come work here. I love it. I've been here for a year. It's fast moving, it's fast paced. I get to play with technology that I haven't been able to play with before. And I get a lot of trust from my leaders. It's cool. Thank you.